Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a sequel. Believe it or not, the sequel is After Bruckner. Yes, composers who took a great deal of their mature style from that of Anton Bruckner. And that's really saying something because, let's face it, folks, who in God's earth wants to sound like Bruckner other than Bruckner? I don't mean Bruckner sounds bad. Not at all. Bruckner sounds glorious, but his style is so idiosyncratic, so personal to himself, particularly in its handling of form, that other composers attempt it at their peril. They really do. On the other hand, a lot of the things that he did purely as sound, sonically that is, the glorious brass chorales, the wonderful use of the strings in tremolo and ostinato, the layered textures, all of those things were ripe for borrowing. And borrow people did, without having to drag with them the rest of the apparatus that was so peculiar to Bruckner that you really couldn't even fake it if you tried. So I'm going to give you samples of 5 composers, musical samples of 4, and 5 composers who, along the lines of their own path, managed to get something of Bruckner into their style. And the interesting thing is to find out precisely what that was. The first composer I'm going to talk about, because I don't have a musical sample, is Furtwängler. Yes, Furtwängler the composer. Now, Furtwängler was, for the most part, an absolutely horrible composer. I mean, dreadful. He wrote 3 symphonies. Numbers 1 and 3 are ghastly. He wrote a monstrous piano concerto symphonic thing. Grotesque. He wrote interminable chamber works. He was a horrific failure as a composer during his lifetime. And the only reason he finally started to finish the works that he'd been sketching and not being able to finish for years because no one in their right mind was going to play them was because of, you guessed it, the Nazis. We hear all of this BS back and forth about how Furtwängler wasn't a Nazi and he hated the Nazis, right? He did. All of that is true. He was definitely not a Nazi. He truly hated the Nazis. No, he was worse. He was an artist. That meant he was a completely self-absorbed, narcissistic monster as a human being, as were most of the great conductors out there. I mean, Toscanini was no better. They had their political ideals and their moral qualms here and there, but by and large, their biggest concern was themselves. And Furtwängler was, of course, just like the rest of them, insanely jealous, completely self-absorbed, and generally pretty miserable as a person to get along with. And so, what happened to him as a composer? Well, you know what his style was. You know what his predilections were. He was a late romantic, conservative, decadent, sort of, German art for all things kind of guy. And he was certainly not sympathetic to contemporary music of his day, and his own compositions, such as we know of them, were pretty dreadful and were, like I said, abject failures in his lifetime. But when the Nazis came to power and they came up with Entartete Musik, and they were as regressive and culturally conservative as Furtwängler himself was. And this was something that they had in common. Let's not make any mistake about it. And so at that point, Furtwängler picked up all this junk he'd been working on for decades and wrapped it all up in a tidy bow because he thought he would be able to perform it. And perform it he did during the Nazi period and immediately afterwards. And then, of course, immediately afterwards, we got the Darmstadt people, the serial people, and the avant-garde extravaganza that ensued in Germany. And Furtwängler was once again relegated to the oblivion that his compositions so richly deserved. However, there was one exception, and that exception is Symphony Number Two. This happens to be a really, really good piece of music. And this recording, this is its only top flight modern recording with Daniel Barenboim and the Chicago Symphony, is absolutely terrific. Now, I actually had an opportunity to talk to Barenboim about this, and he told me he was going to do the Third Symphony, and I begged him not to do the Third Symphony. And I don't know if anything I said to him made any difference. Probably he forgot it as soon as I uttered it, because he's an artist too, and he doesn't care what anyone else says or thinks. But he wound up doing the second. Thank God he wound up doing the second, because this really is a good piece. Now, what does it borrow from Bruckner? Well, the finale is like a monstrous fugue, a la the finale of Bruckner's Fifth. It has, like Bruckner, this intense yearning for spiritual transcendence. I don't think it achieves that. I think that was a total mistake. Furtwängler was far too twitchy and neurotic and worldly a character for all that he, affected all of the, German philosophical sublimity that he could possibly suck up. There was no way he was going to come close to Bruckner in the transcendental department. And one of the best evidences of that is that the slow movement here, which is an andante semplice, is actually quite brief, relatively speaking. It's only 12 minutes long. It's the shortest movement in the symphony. Whereas, of course, had he been a true Bruckner follower, he would have written a monstrous adagio, and, as he sometimes did elsewhere, unfortunately. And it would have been a lot more Bruckner-like. Actually, the only moment in the symphony, its only defect, of course, is that the thematic material is not all that distinctive. Only in the scherzo, which has a real tune, a really good tune, actually, played by the trumpets. Not often enough, as it turns out. But this is a good piece. It's well crafted. It's effective. Yes, the finale may be too long. It may try too hard. But it's surprisingly successful. I think it's a minor masterpiece. I really do. And it's certainly the only piece that Furtwängler wrote that's worth performing these days. It should be played. It should be played, I wouldn't say frequently, but once in a while. And this recording with Barenboim on Teldec is the best. It's really great. There's actually another good one with Joachim on Bavarian, from the Bavarian radio, which is pretty good too. But that one is the best, sonically and interpretively. Now, Furtwängler left us a couple of recordings himself. There's one on Orfeo, which I actually could have played you a sample of, but who cares? And there's the other one he did for Deutsche Grammophon. Both of them are compromised by somewhat soggy sonics, but they're both very good performances, of course. He conducted his own music quite well. And they don't have any of the slovenliness that seems to infect his performances of just about everybody else, which also just goes to show that at the end of the day, the person he cared about most was himself. So that is Furtwängler, the first post-Brucknerian symphonist who managed to squeeze out one really decent work. Next, and this will come as no surprise whatsoever, the guy we need to talk about is Sibelius. Now, Sibelius, as we know, was hugely impressed by Bruckner's Third Symphony, and also the Fifth. He thought Bruckner's sound was incredible, but his form was hopeless. And that was really understandable from a guy who was a master of an organic symphonic form, just the opposite of what Bruckner was doing at the time. However, early in his career, Sibelius really did have a lot more in common with Bruckner than he later did. Nowhere more so than in Kullervo, his first symphony, which he wrote around the same time as he encountered Bruckner's Third for the first time. And the evidence is really clear. It rubs off very clearly. Listen to the opening of Kullervo. I'll play the first couple of minutes in this gorgeous recording with Leif Segerstam and the Helsinki Philharmonic on Ondine, which label will feature rather prominently in this chat. Kullervo. So, what did Sibelius get from Bruckner? Well, there's the use of string ostinatos and tremolos everywhere. There's the thematic substance that often comes from the lower strings, from the cellos. His preference for the cellos rather than the violins, although you don't really hear that in this excerpt. The other thing that you really notice in Kullervo is the complete disjunct form. And you hear that at the end of this section. The music just stops and then goes on to something else. There's this sort of stream of consciousness, cinematic intercutting of musical passages, which Bruckner, of course, did fabulously well. And Sibelius, who later became one of the great masters of musical transition, stopped doing. In fact, he stopped doing it almost right after this symphony. There's a little bit of it left in the first, but elsewhere after that, he was his own man when it came to movement and transition. But he always saved from Bruckner the use of chorales, the tendency to give melodic material to the low strings, the use of figurations and ostinati. All of that has its roots in Bruckner, and Sibelius turned those aspects of Bruckner's style to his own use quite successfully, as I'm sure you will all agree. Some might say even more successfully than Bruckner used them, but that is a more controversial issue. I happen to think that's not true. I think Bruckner was a master at what he was doing. I really do. And more of a master than most of his fans think he was, by the way. Next comes a fascinating composer, also Scandinavian, a work very little known, but that's really quite lovely and worth hearing. And that is the first symphony of Wilhelm Stenhammar. Now, Stenhammer really wrote 3 orchestral masterpieces. There was the Second Symphony, there's the Serenade, both of which we're going to talk about, and his cantata, The Song, which is glorious and really ought to be performed like every 15 minutes. It's magnificent. Those were his 3 big orchestral pieces. The First Symphony he wrote in the early 1900s and disowned it because, as he said, it sounded too much like Bruckner. Well, it does sound a lot like Bruckner. It uses 6 horns. It's very horn-happy. As a symphony, it's quite long. It lasts, I don't know, what does it last, about an hour here or something? And this is Järvi conducting it. Niemi Järvi, who was pretty fast usually, but it's like 17 and 13 is 30, 40, 50 minutes. Good 50 some odd minutes. And it's really lovely. Absolutely lovely. And of course, the movements end with these nice big Bruckner-like coda pile-ups, which we're going to feature from here on in, because I just love the way different composers imitate Bruckner's codas, and you will too. Here is the coda to the first movement of Stenhammer's Symphony Number 1. See what I mean? Now, this is the Stenhammer box that has the symphonies and the piano concertos and some other works on Brilliant Classics, with most of the material licensed from BIS and a few other places. And they're beautiful performances and plenty of fun, and they're well worth having. Absolutely wonderful. And as you can hear, there is a sort of Bruckner-like coda, but it moves too much to be Bruckner. Stenhammer is too lively. Toward the end, it sort of gets its rock and roll going a little bit, and it moves home with a bit too much schwung for genuine, authentic Bruckner. And that perhaps was the problem with Stenhammer, because those two elements, the more motive and call it Brahmsian or more classical side of his character, and the Brucknerian hadn't quite managed to fuse in this symphony, and they don't. But it's a beautiful work and lots of fun to listen to. It doesn't deserve to be neglected, and there are very few recordings of it. Two of them by Nimi Yarvi. There was this BIS one and then the Deutsche Grammophon one, but this one is now on Brilliant Classics. Nice, inexpensive, beautiful set with the two piano concertos as well. Well worth considering. So Stenhammer is a fascinating successor to Bruckner. Next comes another German composer. This is Richard Wetz. Richard Wetz. Richard Wetz. Now, his years were, let's see, 1875 to 1935. Is that what this is, or was it 1873? Something like that. I think, no, it's 1873 to 1935. And he wrote three symphonies that are horrendously post-Brucknerian. It's rather funny, actually, because, none of these people could match Bruckner's breadth of vision. Just the size, the scope. Even when they're, at Bruckner, when he isn't that long comparatively, in his shorter symphonies, there's always a sense of bigness behind everything he does. Partly it's a question of the fact that his pacing is always leisurely. Even when the music moves fast, his pacing is leisurely. Whereas, normal composers, they tend to move more quickly. And so when they co-opt Bruckner's grandeur and they stick it into these sort of more quickly moving, less ambitious, less leisurely paced formal settings, the result tends to sound rather uncomfortable. And that is also true of Richard Wetz. His first two symphonies, well, they all have their moments. They really do. And their moments tend to be Brucknerian moments. But his really best symphony is the third, the last symphony. And it has a coda, which is absolutely hilarious. It is the coda of Bruckner's fifth's greatest hits, is what this coda is. And this performance features Werner Andreas Albert with the Staatsphilharmonie Rheinland-Pfalz. And I'm going to play it for you because it is absolutely a riot. And it's a beautiful work, this third symphony of Wetz. It really, really is. And his music alternates between really lovely and fascinating and Brucknerian sounding and incredibly drab and boring German, nondescript, conservative. It could have been written. This symphony was written like in the 1820s. It could have been written in the 1920s. It could have been written in the 1860s half the time, except for the Bruckner parts, of course. Here is the coda of Wetz's Symphony Number 3, and wow, isn't it like Bruckner? you may have noticed that the Wetz's coda tries to be like Bruckner, but you can tell that he's not quite comfortable with the proportions because the ending goes on too long. One of the things about Bruckner is that his endings could sometimes be quite abrupt. Once he does that great climax, he just stops. And this coda seems to go on for a couple of bars, just a little bit longer than it has any right to. Yeah? But it's still a very effective Bruckner approximation, even if it is in no way comparable to the actual real thing. But you may want to give Wetz a shot. It's fun stuff. It really is. Finally, last but not least, for my money, the most effective Bruckner impersonation comes from Eino Juhani Rautavaara, the late Finnish composer whose third symphony is so Brucknerian, but completely different in all other respects. Here's a composer who understands the Bruckner sound. He understands the sound world and he understands what it means. He knows how to use it to acquire that sense of, nature's mystery, of transcendental chorale, religious, quasi-spiritual stuff. He gets all of it, but he uses it completely for his own purposes. Here is the coda of his third symphony, which is absolutely wonderful. Have a listen. Don't you just love that ending where the horn call sort of from Bruckner's fourth comes popping in at the end with little bird calls and things? Now, there's actually a little bit more to the coda than I played. The symphony ends quietly. It ends with a few more repetitions of the horn call from the opening of Bruckner's fourth or something similar to it. But you get the idea. This is actually a 12-note work in its overall conception, but it doesn't sound like it. In other words, it doesn't have that high level of dissonance, and it doesn't have that sort of non-repetitive, ongoing, continually dissonant development that makes you completely lost in it and you don't know where it is. It's actually a very shapely four-movement symphony, but it really does have Bruckner's sense of bigness, of scale, and more than a little of the idea of transcendence in its harmonic shaping and its expressive intent. But it's so wonderful that he ends quietly. He does a big Bruckner build-up and then has the guts to return to the music of the opening of the symphony, which is that horn call, and end softly and mysteriously. And surely that is more true to the essence of what Bruckner was than those big pile it on, slam, bam, thank you, ma'am, jumbo, gargantuan, brass-laden climaxes, right? Don't you think? Because Rautavaara is his own man, and I think it says more than anything else of his mastery of his own style and of his own music, that he could take these elements from Bruckner and turn them to a completely novel purpose and effect. Rautavaara's Third Symphony is one of the great 20th century symphonies. I recommend that you hear it. This performance, by the way, was with the Leipzig Radio Symphony Orchestra under Max Pommer on Ondine, in this delightful box containing all 8 Rautavaara symphonies. It was also re-recorded by Segerstam, which is also an Ondine. That's a different recording. It's not in this box. It's a little bit newer. It may sound a little bit better, but they're both excellent performances, and it's a lovely, lovely work. So I think that you have, I hope that you have enjoyed these sequels in the style or manner of Bruckner. I hope it's given you some food for thought, something to really think about what does it mean to be influenced and what does it mean to imitate, and what is the difference between the two. Give these works a listen, see what you think. You'll have a great time doing it. I guarantee it. Keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Take care.